Hello, everybody, and welcome to Geopolitical Trends, where truth matters. Excited to be with you as always. And I'm even more excited this evening because of my dear two friends, Dr. Warwick Powell and Einar Tangen. Einar Tangen is not here yet. I have with me in the studio Warwick here, to those who do not know who Warwick Powell is. Warwick is an adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology and a senior fellow at the Tahi Institute in Beijing. He is the author of, here's the book here. I want you guys to be aware of this book here. China, Trust and Digital Supply Chain, the Dynamics of a Zero Trust World. He is also the host of TIO with Warwick Powell. So I'm going to put the link for you in the chat box for those who want to really take a listen at what Warwick has to say. Very, very interesting platform. I do listen to him interviewing some very interesting fellows. So anyway, Warwick, welcome. Good to see you, and thanks for coming on.
It's great to be back with you, David.
It's always exciting. So we'll wait for, while we're waiting on Einar, we're going to go ahead and launch in our conversation here. So, and I would like to have your take, Warwick, about, as you know, in a week and a half ago, Canada and China reached some sort of a limited preliminary deal, trade deal, by which China to reduce tariffs on special goods, such as lowering levies on Chinese electric vehicles and so forth. Now, what I want to know from you, Warwick, what is the significance of this trade deal between Canada and China?
Well, in some ways, it is quite significant because it speaks to a Canadian political leadership or a political class that is willing to explore ways of forging relationships with China in particular that are not entirely consistent with the wishes of its southern neighbor. So in that political sense, it's significant. I also think it's more significant in a global context, in that it speaks to an ongoing unfolding of a process by which global value flows, and by that I mean trade flows and investment flows, are starting to consolidate. Now, over the last 15 to 20 years, China has emerged, of course, as the world's most significant trading country and is the largest trading partner of almost 3/4 of countries around the world. The other thing that's happening as a result of this is that the traditional G7 countries, or the so-called countries of the global north, the developed world, or whatever you want to call it, are starting to consolidate, if you will, a set of value flows, economic value flows, that are increasingly autonomous from the orbit or the magnetic field of the US economy. And that matters because this really continues to consolidate and usher in the multinodal world, where countries are able to build a diverse range of economic relationships with countries of their choosing, where there are complementarities and where countries believe there are mutual benefits. So in those two senses, I think this is an important moment in the evolution of multipolarity or multinodal economics at a global level.
Oh, very interesting. Here's Einar. Hi, Einar.
Hi, David. How are you? Sorry, I'm a little late.
Good. No worries. No worries, Einar. Just for the community, to those who do not know who Einar Tangen is a senior fellow at the CIGI, the Center for International Governance Innovation. He's also an international commentator on geopolitics and global economy. He's based in Beijing, and he specializes in China's role in global governance and urban development. So excited to have you here, Einar. And I'm going to get into it right away with the similar question I asked Warwick earlier. How do you assess the Canadian Prime Minister Carney's recent visit to China, by which he signed about 8 MOUs, reduction of tariffs, 49,000 EVs, Chinese EVs going to be in Canada markets? How do you see it?
Well, it's how to put it this nicely. I mean, it's putting an end to this idea that there was fiction about the U.S. Intentions towards the world. I thought it was brilliant. Actually, I thought it was very strategic. A lot of people, came back afterwards and said, "Oh, I can't believe he said that." But quite frankly, despite all the threats that the U.S. says about Canada, the fact is the U.S. is also dependent on Canada. And I think he's betting that going into the USMCA, which is the U.S., Mexico, Canada trade agreement, that he was better off to show strength based on what he has seen globally. China stands up to Donald Trump. Donald Trump fawns on them. The New York mayor beats all of Donald Trump's surrogates, and he invites him to the White House, where this guy quite freely calls him a fascist. So, and also, with Vladimir Putin. So it's clear that from a strategic point of view, you're always better off standing up to Donald Trump, as long as you have something to back it up. And in Carney's case, he does. I don't think he went far enough in terms of, admitting that, even Canada had its own dark history of, subjugating its native people and things like that, and taking responsibility. Canada has been better than most at doing that, but it would really a historic speech if he had made that additional connection to say, look, we've had 500 years of individuals and countries despoiling the rest of the world, making up fictitious histories, declining, basically saying that, they were a bunch of savages and we came along and helped them. It was the kind of help that India got. They were 24% of the world's GDP prior to the British coming, and they were 4% after the British left. That kind of help continues today. We see this in the Sahels, etc. So this was a watershed moment in terms of the West turning on itself, looking in the mirror and seeing that what was there was not predictable. It was not all the things that they had been preaching. In fact, it was quite the opposite.
And we're gonna be addressing India in a second here. Warwick, I want to go back to just to follow up to what Einar was talking about, and the way I want to look at this from the perspective of the new world order. Is this the message that Canada is sending? That Canada's strategic pivot now to China, some sort of will reshape the global trade dynamics. Will I be wrong in this assessment?
Well, I don't think Canada's big enough to reshape global trade dynamics, but nonetheless, it is contributing to the ongoing multipolarization of global trade patterns. The thing that Canada's doing is diversifying its own exposure. That's the first thing to bear in mind, is that at the moment, about 70% of its exports go to the United States, and it is clearly reaching a view that that extent of exposure to a single market is detrimental to the medium and long-term interests of the Canadian economy. The issue about the new world order, so to speak, and of course Mark Carney chose his words very carefully and articulated them very deliberately and slowly, almost as if he was trained, knowing that this would be replayed ad nauseum across the global media landscape. The point is that there is certainly a step forward in relation to recognizing the fact that sometime in the last decade or so, the order of things in the global sense has changed. The period of Pax Americana ended a while back, notwithstanding the legacy beliefs that some people may have, whether it's culturally or what have you. And but the issue for Carney, I think, is whether or not his sense of a new world order really reflects a multipolar world order, or whether he's seeking to carve out a position as a leader of a pack of what is essentially, he calls them middle powers, but I'd actually describe them as the subordinate Western powers that happen to be of a medium size. The reason why they're middle powers, by the way, is because they benefited from 70 years of the Western-led order, and that was Carney's confession, by the way. Not only did he write an obituary to Pax Americana, he was actually confessing to the fact that a small number of countries benefited at the expense of the vast majority of countries, and not only countries, but actually the vast majority of people around the world. So, plenty of people are jumping on the Carney bandwagon. I can understand that, because this is the first time that someone from inside the club belled the cat, and that's quite remarkable, because usually the tacit acknowledgement from those who benefit from the system is to keep mum about it. And but the fact that the cracks have appeared is significant, because what that tells you is that the system that has served all of these people so well, or all of these nations so well for so many decades, is starting to fall apart. And there is it's inconceivable, in fact, that system can be put back together again.
Very interesting. I wanted to just touch on one more thing with you, Einar, on this topic before we move to the next one. I know that the Chinese officials, the statements that I read coming out of Beijing, stated that this recent agreement with Canada is not meant to undercut other countries. In your opinion, Einar, do you believe that Donald Trump threats to impose 100% tariffs on Canadian products, if Canada finalizes the deal with Beijing, is going to impact the relationship, the economic one, between the US and Canada?
Well, I mean, yes, but it was going to happen anyways. I mean, Carney, as Warwick has pointed out, was looking over the situation, and he had a very practiced and practical approach to it, which is he knew that Donald Trump was going to, lower the boom on Canada. He's made so many disparaging remarks, e.g., we don't care about them. I mean, your two largest trade partners, and you say, oh, they mean nothing. It goes against reality. So he decided, well, we will play our cards and go for it. In terms of 100% tariffs, it's meaningless. And remember that Donald Trump's tariffs are about to disappear. So he can use them freely, knowing fully that the Supreme Court is about to strike down arbitrary tariffs. If he has something that's related to his legal authority to do that, yes, he can make them stick. He can certainly go back and try to manufacture some legal authority by saying, Canada is a security threat. I don't know how that's going to play out in terms of any kind of practical legal argument. But yeah, Carney reads the situation better than Trump does. He sees that this is a man who likes to cause chaos and then see what shakes out, whether or not he has legal authority or not. So yeah, I think he's playing it well. Does somebody who can is 70% of your economy have effect on you? Absolutely. But right now, I think the ball is in Carney's court in terms of how he's played this.
Yeah. Well, I know the Chinese statements wants to make it clear that this was intended to any country, and I see the logic of that. Just the countries wanted to cooperate between the two. So let's move on to
David. Let me say this. I mean,
go ahead, Einar.
I'm on show after show where the commentator says something like, "Oh, China and Russia have somehow engineered this." This is an own goal by the United States. All right, there's no way around that. This is not, China and Russia putting their hand up Trump's posterior and moving his lips. This is entirely due to his negligence. So all of these things about how China should, have to say, "Oh, we're not trying to do anything," they're not. This is all the U.S. and Donald Trump, and he, to the extent that he's an accelerant and trying to hide things, especially around the Epstein files. That's one thing, but he is a symptom of a system. He's been elected twice, not just one after the other. Even he took a hiatus in between. The bookends in the U.S. have moved, but they've moved against the world.
No, I'm with you on this, Einar. I couldn't agree more. And as a matter of fact, the reality, which we're going to be talking about next point right here, has to do with the U.S. Dollar decline. I mean, this is in support of your argument, Einar. Beyond the monetary policy You have this geopolitical uncertainty that is now sort of intensifying the market volatility. That's the way I see it, how it's moving forward. Warwick, how do you think this decline of the US dollar, is it contributed strictly to the geopolitical uncertainty, or is it also the mismanagement of the international dealings or dynamics, especially when it comes down to the economy?
Look, I think that there's a few dimensions to this question, David. I mean, the first thing to bear in mind is that President Trump actually has conflicting objectives in relation to the US dollar and its status in the world and its relative strength. He has, for example, made it very clear that he wants a strong US dollar on the one hand as a bulwark against what he sees as a direct threat to American monetary leadership coming from groups such as BRICS. On the other hand, he also wants to see a significant devaluation of the US dollar from the point of view of dampening imports and boosting exports, according to conventional theory. So, you know, many of Trump's supporters no doubt believe that he can work miracles, but reality is going to say that you can't achieve both of those objectives at the same time. So what we're starting to see is clearly a weakening of the purchasing power of the United States dollar. And in part, that is a function of the economic uncertainties that have been created, the political uncertainties, and the weaponization ultimately of the United States dollar. I think that there's a longer term dynamic at work, though, and that is that the US dollar, which is, by the way, issued as the sole you know, right of the United States, has been accepted around the world for 7 to 8 decades or even longer as a means of payment for goods and services that have been produced and supplied from elsewhere. And these are IOUs. And these IOUs have economic significance because, in theory, you're able to then use those IOUs in exchange for things that you believe are of use, right? Whether it's to purchase things that are made in the United States or to purchase American assets. Now, most of these IOUs that are circulating in the global system end up purchasing American financial assets, or what I call fictitious capital, which is rights to future economic value. Progressively, less and less of these circulating US dollars goes towards buying things of use value from the United States, in large part because the United States makes fewer and fewer things that the rest of the world needs and wants. So the long-term material foundational capability or the utility of the United States dollar diminishes because literally you don't need the US dollar to buy most of the things that you need. Probably the pièce de résistance in relation to this issue goes to the question of energy. So the US dollar was necessary as a means of securing energy resources, particularly biocarbons from the Middle East, oil. But it is quite clear that oil can be traded in denominations other than the US dollar. So the US dollar no longer holds that position. And it is inevitable as a result that the US dollar will decline in significance in relative terms globally, and we're seeing that. So a combination of short-term dynamics together with long-term foundational structural transformations inevitably will lead to a declining relevance of the US dollar at a global level. Now, from President Trump's point of view, in terms of his second objective, which is to make the improve the price competitiveness of US manufactured goods. In theory, this will be good. I say in theory because in practice, it actually reduces purchasing power. And for the US to export things, it also needs to import a whole bunch of stuff, including capital equipment and intermediate goods. And a devaluation of the US dollar will actually make it more expensive for the American production system to do that. The other thing that it will also do is that it will reduce living standards in America. So what's happening in short, and the declining value of the US dollar is a symptom of this, is that the United States economy is transitioning into a higher cost, lower standard of living system. And this is the inevitable consequence of the policies that have been pursued by not only this administration, but previous administrations as well.
Well, thank you. That's very, very insightful, Warwick. Thank you so much for that. Einar, I would like to keep another part of this conversation regarding this specific topic with one action that was taken by one particular country, and that country is Japan. So the moment that the US dollar declined, the Japanese central bank decision was to maintain interest rate unchanged. What is, in your opinion, from a financial standpoint of view, what is your opinion about this move by the central bank in Japan for doing so, knowing that only a few months ago, they sold, I believe, what it was, about $700 billion worth of US debt?
Yeah, I mean, Japan is particularly exposed to the US. It's one of the leading holders of it, but across the world, you're starting to see countries divest themselves of treasuries, which, as Warwick points out, are future IOUs on the value of the United States. Japan is locked in a particularly difficult situation because they have a leader who has made a bet on the US, and now she has egg on her face, but not before she declared an election, snap election. And her personal popularity is high, but it's declined 6 points since the time that she called for that snap election, mostly in regard to her over-reliance on Donald Trump, his then speech at Davos, which exposed the world. Then you have the strategic white paper that comes out, defense white paper, in essence saying we don't give a shit about Japan or anybody else. We're just going to maintain ourselves. We're going to take over the Western Hemisphere. Any kind of move in this situation that allies yourself with the U.S. is going to be toxic for all the reasons that Warwick has just pointed out. But, let's add some facts and figures to this. The U.S. has getting near $40 trillion worth of national debt and getting near $20 trillion worth of personal debt. That's nearing 60 trillion. We have a global economy of 100 trillion. The U.S. is around 27 trillion. You start to see the picture here about Warwick, what Warwick has said about a declining power. I see it as competitiveness. The U.S. kept a strong dollar, and as a result, it hollowed out its manufacturing industries because they're no longer globally competitive. Why? Because a strong dollar means that you're competing against currencies that are weaker. They have lower cost of inputs in terms of labor. They have lower expectations on return of the dollars. So Japan is, I believe that their problems are with reality and politics, which don't necessarily come together. Japan needs the kind of leadership that says not, oh, we're going to run to China. That's not a solution in itself. They have deep-seated structural issues in terms of their own industries, population, and how they expect to run an economy. So they're right now are floating in the air. I think they come back to reality, I'm assuming that she will not get the response that she wants. Her party is at 28% approval rating, although most stalwart members of the party have said they'll support it. The overwhelming number are undecided, and a lot of that is going to be reflected by the events that we're talking about in terms of Donald Trump, U.S. Treasuries, the direction of the economy, etc.
Well, that's an interesting observation, Einar, given that I was surprised when I heard and read about the snap elections that's going to be on February 8th, if I'm not mistaken. But my sense was that the problem, part of it has to do with her provocation towards the Chinese that was fueled by the Americans. And I kind of argued that back then. And of course, I got some nasty comments that, no, that's not the case. I say, I bet you that's the case. And here we are now, we're seeing what we're seeing.
Yeah, I don't think that's the entirety of it. I mean, that was a provocation that was pushed by Trump because he was not able to create a successful pressure on China to give him what he wanted, which were rare earths. He had visited her. Obviously, she was not going to violate the ambiguity understanding by herself. This would have to be with U.S. support. She had a staged, question thrown at her, and she threw that out there. But that's politics. That's what I say, floating in air. The reality is that Japan needs somebody who can institute structural reform. What has been her response? Just yesterday, she declared that she's going to stop collecting taxes on consumption. Well, that was part of the structural reform package of the person she supposedly admired, which was Shinzo Abe. And he said, no, we have to get real here. We have to have a government that's supported by something other than 250% of debt to GDP. So, as I said, this is a country that's floating in the air. It's completely dependent on the United States, and yet it refuses to come back to the reality that it needs to change its economic fundamentals and to create space between itself and what is going to be a Titanic. America has hit the debt iceberg. And right now you have people talking about, should the band play on? And the fact is these countries need to find lifeboats and get out as soon as possible.
Warwick, I want to touch on one aspect regarding Greenland while I'm thinking about it from an economic perspective before we move into the next. I'm going to share this map here. This one here is for the near Greenland. That's the water passage there. And my arguments for this one here is that my assumption is that what Donald Trump stated about Greenland, it's a way of sort of controlling the geopolitical gateway that enables monitoring both military and economic movements between the three continents. Will I be wrong if I am to say that this specifically aimed at China because China's investments in Greenland?
Well, everything that the United States does is underpinned by the fact that China lives rent-free inside the head of everyone inside the Beltway. The American policy posture is largely driven by, on the one hand, a belief that that they've been hard done by, and that China is the greatest perpetuator of every grievance that the Americans currently have, on the one hand. And secondly, that China represents the United States' most significant economic and arguably military threat as well. So it's a useful frame to have in place when we're thinking about American actions, is how does whatever the action is fit inside a general framework that views China as America's greatest challenge and greatest threat. But I think that there's a lot of cartoonish elements to almost all of this calculus. The cartoonish elements go to things like simplistic ideas of geography. If you actually look at the Arctic and the ocean passageways, it is quite clear, and it is that there are many choke points. Number one, so you can see the Bering Straits, which is actually quite significant from China's point of view. But ultimately, there's international waters. So what are we talking about? What we're talking about is the United States, if this is its calculus, thinking about how it can ultimately intercede normal global trade traffic by militarizing international waters. It's clearly been doing that around Venezuela, but good luck to it trying to do that in relation to the Arctic. The other point to remember is that much of the navigatable waters actually is running along the Russian coastline. So that's the second thing to remember. The third thing to remember is that the United States doesn't really have the maritime capability to participate at this stage in a meaningful way in the Arctic, because it doesn't have a significant fleet of icebreakers, nor the capacity to manufacture them. So that's the third thing to remember. So, and I guess the last thing to remember, David, is the United States already has a military base on Iceland and has had one there for a long time, right? So, so you do have to wonder what it is about this obsession with, imperial land grabs that we see from Washington. I mean, I actually don't buy any of the calculus, because none of it actually makes real sense, other than through this sort of cartoonish, simplistic lens that perhaps, I guess, is what drives a lot of Washington's analysis and ultimately its policy decision making. It seems to be the case all over the place, by the way, that it has caricatures of how the world works, and it goes ahead and does things based on these caricatures.
That's the Einar, is will I be right if I will say that the death of the global system that was headed by the United States has come to an end, especially in the last summit in Davos, given what the Europeans are saying versus what Donald Trump was saying, especially when it comes down to this Greenland matter?
All right. Well, Davos simply put on stage the hypocrisy. It just had arrived at a point where it was no longer supportable. In terms of Greenland, there's a couple of things that I think explain it. One is it's not the U.S. not only had one base there, they had 6. They used to have 15,000 troops there. They drew it down to 150. That had nothing to do with Greenland. It had to do with the priorities of the United States. They have almost an unlimited right to install anything that they want there in terms of early warning. They do have significant facilities there, etc. And they also have a suspected nuclear base there. So this is all a tempest in a teapot. But the question is why? Why antagonize European power to go after this? And unfortunately, I think the truth is nothing to do with geopolitical control. It has to do with the ego of Donald Trump. He wants his face. He's not been shy about it. He wants his face on Mount Rushmore. In fact, he has a model of what it should look like. So, this is the intersection where you have policy and ego. And in this particular case, Donald Trump was convinced by the neocon side that, go out there and, grab this piece of ice. He's so wedded to the idea, he doesn't even know what he's talking about. 3 times during his speech, he referred to Iceland, which is not Greenland. And he also referred to the fact that China is a neighbor there. Show me on that map where China is anywhere near that area. That's Russia. I mean, but these are kind of the bold-faced nonsense that he says on a daily basis. And unfortunately, he says so many of them that the press does not follow up on them. They just go unanswered because there's too many lies, and there's too much for anyone to follow. If I tell you one lie, you can concentrate on it. If I tell you 40 lies, and then and the next day I'm going to do exactly the same thing. But there's also this other element, and I know you're probably tired of hearing this, but a lot of this has to do with his domestic ills. Why at this time? The Epstein files are looming large, 2 million pages of which he does not know the full extent of his exposure. You have the killings in Minneapolis, which are going against him. His domestic agenda is in tatters, and his base is fracturing. And I'm not saying that because you can see it play out on social media. There are questions as to why he spends his time overseas on these adventures, saying he's bringing peace to the world, when his promise was he was going to be an isolationist president, that he was going to pull in. He was going to take care of America first, control prices, all right, create jobs. None of that has come to fruition. And instead, you have now in America, which is overwhelming, over 50% of Americans are one crisis away from a downward spiral that could lead to homelessness. And I'm not saying that to be anti-American American. This is something that there's a conclusion by the U.S. Fed. So, you're in a situation where he's becoming increasingly desperate to hide his domestic issues. He has these overwrought ambitions to be known and then go down in history as a great president. But he just doesn't quite understand the reality of what he's doing.
No, I know what you're saying is the truth. Some of us Americans here do not want to hear it. And that's the problem. That's why the media is not following up with the stories like you mentioned. I mean, I'm here, I live here, I watch and I read. There's nothing that will follow exactly as to what's good for the country. And we know how this ends. Just for the community, I wrote an article to follow up to what Einar and Warwick talked about, the decline of the dollar. I'm going to post it for you in the chat box. You can take a look at it later on. So I like to move the conversation to talk about India. I cannot ignore this particular aspects of this discussion, and there is a reason for that, why I wanted to solicit your input and your insights regarding this particular issue. And I'll go with you, Einar, first. Opening what India just did was they opened the commercial doors to China by scrapping the 5-year-old restrictions that was placed on the Chinese firms not to bid on a government contract. Now, India is reversing this. What's behind it?
The U.S., Donald Trump, 50% tariffs, personal, what are perceived in India as personal attacks on Modi, saying that Donald Trump settled the dispute between Pakistan and India. It directly undermines the strongman persona that Modi projects. The fact that you've had 2 color revolutions in Nepal and Bangladesh, both with the fingerprints of U.S. Regime change operations like National Endowment for Democracy. And then as I mentioned, the 50% tariffs, the additional 10% tariffs, because they're part of the BRICS, 50% because they trade oil with Russia, despite the fact that it was the United States who came to India and said, look, we're going to have these sanctions on Russia. We cannot afford to have an oil shock. A massive rearrangement without an outlet for Russian oil would result in a catastrophe for us, because you'd have prices going up. So they were asked to do this. They were happy to do it. They have been making money at it. But this kind of reversal and accusing them of doing this goes to the heart not only of the political reality for Modi in terms of making him look weak. I mean, I don't know if your viewers have seen that, but certainly look it up. Donald Trump starts talking about Modi and acting as if Modi is pleading with him that he's some sort of weakling that has to go to daddy in order to get what he needs. This is something that Modi cannot ever forgive. He's a strongman politician. To be cast as a weakling like this by somebody he thought was, quote, a friend, kind of friend who calls you up on your birthday one day and congratulates you, and the next day says to Europe, put 100% tariffs on India because they're trading in Russian oil. So all indications are that politically India is hamstrung. Now, what's their economic situation? The U.S. is one of the few countries they have an economic surplus with. They have an economic deficit with China. This is going to hurt them. But why has this come about? Because Donald Trump was trying to insist that Modi commit political suicide. And by that, I mean, Donald Trump said, you have to open your dairy and your agricultural markets to America. America could easily undercut them, but here's the problem. You start looking at the number of farmers, which are almost like 45% of the population, and who, of course, have a tremendous amount of following. People, they feel very attached to their agricultural past. These people would be, in essence, put out of business, and they would go completely bonkers. They would go for any party that promised them that this was not going to happen. So Modi was in a situation where the U.S. was asking for the impossible politically and economically, and then punishing him as an individual, his stature, and the country. So there is no other alternative. I can assure you, having been a regular on Indian TV for the last many years, India harbors no fond feelings for China. But the reality right now is they have very few recourses.
Wow, very interesting. Warwick, I'm left to ask the fundamental question, especially in light of this development. Should China be wary of India, especially when you consider that India is simultaneously racing to militarize the Himalayan border with the infrastructure design explicitly to contain Chinese influence? Will I be wrong?
I'll deal with the Indian question shortly, but let me just quickly touch on the question of the rules-based international order from before, because I think it's important to realize that, in fact, the United States has confirmed the precise character of the rules-based international order, and that is its willingness to act capriciously and to impose an environment where one rule applies to them and others apply to others, right? The reason why Mark Carney and others are belling the cat on that isn't so much that this comes as a shock to them. It's the fact that they are now the target as well. It was all well and good while they were on the inside of the club, right, benefiting, as Carney said, from actually what the rules-based international order was. And the distinction that we need to make here is actually between international law as opposed to the American rules-based international order. Right. So when people talk about the rules-based international order being defunct, I actually say, no, it's not. The United States has actually simply reaffirmed precisely the character of the rules-based international order. What's defunct is the mythology about it amongst a bunch of Western nations. So that's the first thing. Look, the Indian question, I think the thing to understand is that countries need to deal with each other regardless of whether or not they trust or don't trust others in a deep, deep sense, particularly when you have land borders. So you need to have a mature, practical approach to dealing with others, including and in particular countries that you share borders with. The fact that there is a history means that you need to take those things into account as ways of evaluating the risks and the probabilities that particular agreements will be upheld or not, and how good the so-called deals will be. The fact that there continues to be border disputes means that China will, of course, be wary about that. But you have to be able to have a multi-dimensional view about relationships. The Indian economy, incidentally, whilst it has high notional GDP growth rates, is not necessarily where India per se aspires it to be. And I say that because manufacturing output as a proportion of GDP is actually declining. And this runs counter to the Made in India policy strategy that has been a centerpiece of the current administration. So much of the GDP growth is taking place in non-industrial areas, in services and those sorts of things. So I think it's important to sort of understand the structural dynamics, firstly, of the Indian economy. The second thing is that the Indian economy has long been a protected economy. There has been for decades a strong reluctance amongst the political elite to open trade up for some of the reasons Einar discussed, particularly in terms of the agricultural voting bloc and the need to protect certain sectors of the political economy. But I think that the changes in the global dynamics is forcing Indian policymakers to revisit many of these questions. And we're seeing that in the fact that in the last 24, 48 hours, India and the EU have executed what is in effect a free trade agreement that had been subject to negotiations for, in effect, 2 decades. India comes to these kind of trade agreements very reluctantly historically. It was, for example, on the cusp of signing RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which is the Southeast Asian Pacific partnership, including the ASEAN nations, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and China, of course. And but at the last minute, having been party to all of the negotiations and discussions, India chose not to sign onto that agreement. I wouldn't be surprised if over the next 12 to 18 months, it will begin to revisit that question as well, because it understands that its own economic aspirations can only be fulfilled ultimately by opening up its economy for more effective trade with others. And by the way, that does include increasing trade with China. It's opened up its government contracting books, as you mentioned, in large part because its previous approach wasn't working, right? So practical reasons drove this. The previous approaches, having prohibited, in effect, Chinese firms from bidding for these projects, meant projects either didn't happen or they've been over budget and over time. Right now, that doesn't help India progress its economic development ambitions. The last thing I'll say in relation to India, and this is, I think, quite an interesting dimension, is that in recent times it is starting to undertake an energy evolution, right? Particularly in the arena of low-cost renewable or clean energies. Much of that is being made possible by Chinese technologies upstream, and so whilst I can understand for domestic political reasons why India doesn't make a big deal about all of that, the reality is that policymakers who are responsible for actually doing real things understand exactly what makes it viable for India to modernize its economic structure and to develop its industrial base. And it will be compelled ultimately to adjust its policy settings in relation to its trade and investment relations with others.
Well, I'm hoping so, Warwick, because history tells me otherwise, as to see the trends of how the politicians in New Delhi certain approach, maybe because we dealt with them on a different level. We dealt on the intelligence matters. So maybe in the economic, it will be different. I hope so, but we shall see.
Well, David, if they don't, their economy won't actually fulfill the ambitions that they have, and they'll end up facing other kinds of problems. That ultimately is going to be a policy choice and a political choice that decision makers in New Delhi will make. But the economic reality is that their current policy settings won't actually fulfill their industrialization ambitions. Headline GDP growth figures underpinned by services isn't ultimately going to do what they want to do. They're not going to be able to achieve not only manufacturing upgrades, nor let alone moving up the ladder in relation to the digitalization and an information sector underpinned economy. If your entire ICT architecture is premised on being a service outpost for American software firms, then you're not developing domestic capability, right? You're selling your data off to others, and you're not going to have any capability in the end of being able to run a domestic information-based economy. That's a security risk, and that's an economic risk. It's a matter for New Delhi to make those decisions about, but these are the realities that it is starting to have to deal with. And I guess my proposition is that whilst there no doubt will be debates about exactly how to navigate all of this, particularly in terms of the delicate issue of China, and also the tendency for many Indian capitalists to lean towards the United States, which is what they've historically done. Notwithstanding all of that, you can put your head in the sand and ignore what's going on around you for a period of time, but at some point, economic reality asserts itself in a pretty brutal way.
For sure. Einar, I had a chance to read the Global Risk Report for 2026, and it was done by just for the community. I'm going to put the link for you. It's a private group that deals with, I'm sure it's also shared this with the intelligence communities and so forth. But my not a question, but rather just my observation is that the theme of the report basically warned that the global economy is entering into some sort of a phase of escalating geopolitical tension, but also economic risks. How accurate is this assessment, in your opinion, Einar, if we are to sort of move the US from the equation?
Well, you're not going to remove the U.S. from the equation. The question is it going to try to drag down a good portion of the global economy? If you look, what have we been discussing here has basically all been about the effects of the United States, whether it's on India, its own dollar, its politics vis-a-vis Europe and Greenland, etc. So the U.S. is a strong country. It has a lot of resources. It has to hit bottom before it's going to wake up and say, okay, it's not a unipolar world. It hasn't been for quite some time, and we have to realize that and start dealing with countries not as vassals, but as independent entities that somehow have their own sovereignty. Until that happens, it's very difficult to see the U.S. Digging its way out of its debt pile and everything else. It has to become more competitive. The fact is, the U.S. dollar will go down, whether Donald Trump pushes it down or whether the economic realities bring it down. So, this sudden announcement that we have, or I shouldn't say sudden, but this supposedly deep insight that we have geopolitical Sturm und Drang, and then on top of that, economic. I don't really see that as particularly insightful. This has been something that people like Warwick have been talking about for years. It just didn't happen recently because Carney exposed it. This was a huge underlying current that has been going in the same direction for quite some time.
Wow, that's I can understand that part of that argument for it. So I just was wondering about, will it be a fair assessment on their part? And speaking of the latter part of this, Warwick, a part of this assessment that the report did, they're saying that it will be a continuation of the slowing economy or global growth in this aspect. But when I look back a few months ago, and I saw the Chinese surplus that happened, and of course it was interpreted here differently. I had a chance to read your piece on the Substack, which, by the way, I'm going to share it with the community in the chat box. I highly recommend for the community, if you take time to read. It's very heavy. Let me just warn you, it's very heavy. Just read it. You're going to read it twice and you'll understand it. And you mentioned in the 5th paragraph, Warwick, that the way by which we gauge and assess the GDP, it's the wrong approach. Can you please elaborate on this vis-a-vis what this global risk report indicating about the global growth?
Look, gross domestic product is in large part a measure of what I call exchange value. Market priced exchange value. It doesn't necessarily give you any indications of what the what I call use values are in the economic system at large. And those use values aren't just physical things. They can, of course, be services that people or machines perform. But when you are including in your measure of economic size and capacity imputed rents, of which are based on market rates underpinned by a failing real estate market that drives up asset values and drives up rents, that's not a real economy. Right? That's a confected, financialized economy. When you're counting in your so-called economic measures things that are happening in relation to the financial services sector or the ballooning healthcare sector, which in the United States represents almost 20% of GDP now, that's not necessarily equivalent to a real economy of use value. So that's the first thing to remember. The second thing is that, and this really goes back to Simon Kuznets, who developed the idea of GDP, who said even at the time in testimony to Congress that the nation's welfare can hardly be measured simply by GDP alone. So I guess that article tries to firstly reopen up a thought process around how it is that we understand economic welfare. But it also then seeks to understand something else, which is how it is that you can have growing or rising standards of living and growing economic size in use value terms, whilst your GDP rate of growth declines. And I think that's China is a great example of that. But China is not the first historical example, by the way, and the paper talks about that as well, which is the period of the what is often seen as a great deflationary period in American and Western economic history in the second half of the 1800s, where in fact production output and all those sorts of things increased quite significantly, wages increased, and yet we had a deflationary environment. And what that points to is actually that that deflationary environment, falling prices, is not a result of a collapse in aggregate demand at all, but was a function of increasing abundance. Whilst demand grew, so did output capability and productivity. So that's what that paper tries to do. Look, in the global question, I think needs to be understood in a few ways. One is obviously in terms of how we measure these things anyway. But the second one is whether or not, in fact, having this sense of global economic growth necessarily tells us the kinds of things that we need to understand. And I would suggest that perhaps it doesn't quite. And I mean by that the need to understand the fact that there is significant variation in economic development and growth across different parts of the world. And so if you looked at the IMF's first World Economic Outlook report that was released a couple of days ago, you'll find that key centers of economic growth globally revolve around Asia, China, India, also Nigeria and West Asia, the what those in Europe and the UK once called the Middle East. And they are important poles of significant above average economic growth rates. And what that tells us is that, in fact, the global South and South-South dynamics is actually far more significant now as far as drivers of economic welfare are concerned than what's going on in the historic developed North. This partly explains why Mark Carney is reorienting Canadian economic policy. It partly explains, of course, why German manufacturers have invested more in China in the last 12 months than they had previously. It partly explains why Keir Starmer is visiting Beijing this week. So the global landscape is changing. And it's not just a question of an aggregate average of something that we call global GDP growth. What you've got to understand is actually the component parts and, I guess, get the level of measurement correct. And my view is that the level of measurement that we need to be much more mindful of is not the single number called global growth, but it's actually the composition of that growth at a geographical level and what the interconnected linkages are between the different regions of the world. And once we understand that level, or have that level of view of what's going on globally, then I think we can see why the pressure points are starting to manifest themselves in the North American economic system and causing the kind of issues that Einar actually elaborated on earlier. The social fragmentations that are happening are a consequence of a failing political economy, right? And this idea of global economic risk and global growth masks those sorts of problems. The last thing I'll say on this point, David, very, very quickly, is that the last 12 months, we saw a full frontal attack on global trade institutions by virtue of the willy-nilly tariff regimes that the Trump administration imposed. And there is no doubt that it affected trade flows in many ways. But one thing it didn't do was dampen trade growth across the board, particularly trade growth south to south. And we saw that as evidenced by the fact that China's own trade experience grew substantially above average. And most of that, incidentally, took place in the trading relationships with the global south, and in particular in machinery and equipment, in clean energy, EVs, and in semiconductors. Right. So most of the trade growth from an export point of view, China to the global south, was actually industrialization empowering capability into these parts of the world. And that's going to change the landscape as well, because the global economy can really only be understood when we understand the distribution of productive capability, right? And the transformation of the productive capability in different parts of the world. The United States has been deindustrializing and financializing for a long time. This is one of the reasons it's got the problems that it has.
Wow. Well, I mean, it was very insightful article. Thank you so much, Warwick, for sharing that knowledge. To the community, just please, I can, you know, if I recommend something for you, it's for a reason. I highly recommend you take time and read it. No, it's the importance of it. Here is the thing, Warwick. I have, you know, and I've been around here, you know, you kind of talk with some scholars and so forth in the world of economy. They will not explain it in those terms. So you don't hear that kind of perspective that needed to have a better understanding of what's going on. So that's why I was very excited to read that article. So Einar, I need to ask you one specific question here about NATO. It was a recent poll which indicate that about 8 NATO members, Slovenia, Luxembourg, Turkey, Bulgaria, Spain, Montenegro, Iceland, and Greece, show significantly a higher approval rating of at least a minimum of 10 points up for China's leadership over the United States. How significant is this, given the current geopolitical landscape?
Well, it's significant, but I would argue that it's an outcropping of exactly what Warwick has been talking about. I mean, people should not only read that paper, but they should pay a lot of attention to Warwick. He's one of the most brilliant, forward-looking economists that are out there. He's one of the few people who explores the intricacies of this. But, you know, to put it simply, you have a world which is distorted by the fact that it has false measures. If I don't have something that can measure something correctly, all right, obviously my idea about progress is going to be completely wrong. It has caught up to us. And Warwick is one of the few people who's sounding the bell. Many people are saying there's something rotten in the state of Denmark, but I don't mean that in the sense of Denmark itself. I mean, from the Shakespearean point of view, but they don't necessarily point to it. They think that it's either China or that, you know, there's domestic politics in the US. This has been building for a long period of time. And we're seeing the consequences in terms of what's happening to China. China obviously has a strong contrasting point of view to the US. They believe that the pie can be made bigger and that more people can share in that. And they see it as a shared future for mankind, as opposed to, I'm going to grab everything I can and, you know, sit behind my walls and enjoy it while you starve, which is in essence what the United States is trying to push, and why countries are saying that doesn't sound like it's good for me. The Chinese seem much more reasonable, despite all the rhetoric being put out by the third largest military budget in the world, which is the U.S. budget in terms of domestic and international interference. Number one being, of course, the military itself. So, you know, it's showing that you can only float on rhetoric for so long before reality steps in.
Indeed. Warwick, how do you see it? Is this a reflection of the new multipolar order, especially by those NATO members?
Well, you know, as I said earlier, you know, reality at some point in time starts to assert itself, and it brings itself to the table in often unexpected ways. There are deep historical forces at work, and no single country can dictate the trajectory of these developments, but nonetheless, the dynamics at work are the consequence of the entire interaction of all of these nations across the world. Some nations become more aware of what's going on earlier than others, or some groups of nations become more aware of what's going on than others, and are therefore able to navigate the evolutions and the changes more effectively, and in some ways also nudge them, guide them, and manage their speed. Others don't. Right. So, you know, I mean, you know, what these relatively small countries ultimately do, I guess ultimately depends upon their own evaluation of what's going on in the world and how it is that they can best navigate it. If we're talking about NATO, for example, NATO is clearly under incredible stress economically as a group of nations, but of course militarily. And whilst it beats its chest, there are big question marks about whether or not it has a viable future. And that is going to have to, these countries are going to need to come to grips with not only questions of their own security in that environment, but also how they can reshape security and prosperity together.
So, Warwick, stay with me, please, because Einar has to go. He is there's some other commitments for him.
One last question.
Yeah, just quickly, Einar, I just want to get your take. Last word from you. What are your most serious sort of concerns about facing the global economy moving forward?
Well, I don't think there's going to be a war deliberately, but we're fast getting to the point where we could accidentally sleepwalk into one.
Yeah.
And by that, I mean the desire by Donald Trump to deflect attention from his domestic issues has led him to make often outrageous statements and take outrageous positions vis-a-vis the world. The problem is that those are framed with the movement of troops and ships. For instance, right now, there's a huge flotilla of U.S. warships off of Iran. Now, what could happen? Well, you could have any number of things happen in terms of a real friction between these countries, leading to some sort of escalation. This would have a very serious effect on the world economy, which is already reeling from U.S. Adventures and pressures around the world. So this is what I'm concerned about, that Donald Trump's personal ambitions and fears are going to wreak havoc and cause accelerate what I see as a global meltdown that will affect the U.S. dollar and the entire globe. And right now, the only way that the countries can come together, and I would take a page from Mark Carney on this, is they have to come together and confront the U.S. It is time for all countries, not just middle ones, everyone who's been affected by Donald Trump, which is everybody, including some penguins on an otherwise uninhabited number of islands off of Australia, to say, look, you want to tax your people, fine, but do not pit the rest of the world in some sort of colonialist, cynical game of bidding for your attention, daddy. This should be apparent to all of the countries. China is not going to directly confront the U.S. It's not going to fight a war in South America because it's logistically impossible and would not solve anything and just more deaths. But until the world realizes it's time to come together with BRICS, with South America, with the Middle East, Africa, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia, go to the U.S., tell Donald Trump it's time to taco, find something else to terrorize the world with, or your own people.
Well, Einar, I can't thank you enough, man. I know you have to go. On behalf of the entire community, we truly appreciate you being here and look forward to having you next time.
Thank you.
You take care. Bye-bye. Yeah. Warwick, yeah, you're still with me. Don't go yet, because Einar had to go. I still want to ask, because I had one particular, really, you came to my mind when I was asked by someone to do an analysis about China in Latin America, and you came to my mind, and that is why I kept the question. I wanted to ask the question. In your opinion, first of all, what was the kidnapping or the abduction of Maduro was all about?
Well, look, I think I've said it on a number of occasions, but in part it was a demonstration of American power within its backyard, within its region, a bit like a dog marks its territory. So that's the first thing. And having spent many months building up military forces off the coast of Venezuela, it was inconceivable that the United States would somehow not actually do anything. That would have been a tremendous loss of face. So something had to be done. The second thing is, I guess, the kidnapping clearly demonstrates American disregard for international law. Unsurprising. This is what I mean by the American rules-based international order. This is an example of it at work, but in an extreme sense. There's obviously lots of theories about why it is that the kidnapping went relatively smoothly, why there was no air defense, what the post-kidnapping negotiations and behavior has been like. Of course, as I touched on earlier, there's always, China always looms in the minds of many inside the Beltway, and there would have been, I think, in part a view that this was an attack on Chinese interests and China's foothold, so to speak, inside Latin America, and ultimately through Venezuela, an attempt to disrupt BRICS. Right? But again, this is a caricature. Yes, the majority of Venezuelan oil went to China, but Venezuela supplied between 2 and 4% of China's oil. So in the scheme of things, it's actually
nothing.
It's not overly significant, and it's not what you'd describe as irreplaceable either. The other thing is of course, there is the American commercial interests, which was quite evident when President Trump on many occasions talked about reclaiming what was stolen. Right, so the nationalization of Venezuelan oil over the decades was seen by President Trump as a theft of what is rightfully America's, or belonging to American companies. And so there is a belief that this is about getting back what is mine. And we've already seen that with the United States playing oil trader. But again, none of this stuff is ever quite as easy as people make it out to be. People talk about Venezuela having the largest proven reserves, but to actually get reserves out of the ground and then shipped from A to B requires a substantial commitment of fixed capital development in Venezuela itself, and quite clearly, companies are quite reluctant to do that. Reluctant for domestic uncertainty questions, both in Venezuela but also elsewhere. Uncertainty about the long-term future of where global oil's going, and you have to also remember that oil from Venezuela has some very particular qualities which require quite an expensive process of refining for that oil to be of particular utility, and that capacity also needs to be developed if that Venezuelan oil is to come good, so to speak. So for a raw material to actually become economically meaningful, it usually involves a significant amount of capital investment in transportation infrastructure, extractive infrastructure, and processing infrastructure. So, President Trump might have a view that he's reclaiming what rightly belongs to the United States, but I think he seriously underestimates the complexities and the resource costs that are going to be involved in even making any use of all of this. In the meantime, the political price that's paid is arguably not overly significant from a short-term point of view, but there's no doubt that at this moment, given other things going on in the world, and the fact is that this intervention reinforces in the minds of countries around the world, whether they're from the global north or the global south, that the United States has become an unreliable and a risky counterparty prone to violent interventions when it doesn't get what it wants. And so other countries will increasingly tread warily as the United States seeks to engage with them in different ways. I mean, we saw in the last 24 hours moving away from Venezuela, but President Trump made a tweet basically, announcing, more tariffs on the Republic of Korea, notwithstanding so-called trade deals that were arrived at earlier. All it tells you is that these so-called deals that are being announced left, right, and centre are not really worth the social media message that gives them life, let alone whatever paper they're written on. And,
you're absolutely correct.
The United States is basically a capricious and an unreliable counterparty in the world, economically speaking.
Well, you're absolutely correct. I mean, where this is going with especially in Venezuela. Yeah, you're absolutely correct about how much oil China gets from Venezuela. Not much. It amounts to, to my knowledge, about 3.7 to 4%. That's it. Between 300 to 470,000 barrels. That's about it. So, where my concern, Warwick, where my concern, Warwick, is, and I would like to have your input on this, is that how it's going to manage its investment of $106 billion in the Venezuelan that are part of the loans that China provided, especially in the energy sector.
Yeah, look, I mean, China has lent money to Venezuela, and that money, those loans have been renegotiated for repayments to be made in oil, right? With a mechanism by which that oil is valued, so that you can sort of say, well, this many barrels of oil equals this much RMB against the loan. So China does have some interests, quite clearly, or at least Chinese companies, and the Chinese government, I think, will quietly work behind the scenes to ensure that those interests are respected. Now, at the moment, that means navigating an environment where the United States has taken charge, taken control, hijacked Venezuelan oil, and where the new Venezuelan interim government continues to convey, I guess, some mixed signals about where it stands on most matters. I think it's in survival mode, perhaps at the moment. Time will tell, but so long as China continues to receive those barrels of oil, the conditions of the loan are being satisfied. Now, whether or not the Americans will seek to rip that up, well, that'll be a test for the Americans. Should they do that, that will give rise to two things. One is, of course, reinforcement of the widening and deepening impression that the Americans are capricious and untrustworthy, so therefore hard to do long-term agreements with. But secondly, it would be an incredibly provocative act that could spark off some very significant and potentially dangerous reactions from China itself. The last thing I'll say on this one, David, is President Trump is scheduled to visit Beijing in April this year. And one thing that President Trump, I think, has a knack for is to try to at least build points of leverage in the lead up to discussions that he has with others, so as to have something to bring to the table. Now, these are things that theoretically could be points of leverage in discussions over the next 8 weeks in the lead up to President Trump's visits to Beijing. So, it's a space to watch carefully. And I would be surprised if the Americans acted rashly in relation to China's oil interest between now and then.
That will be very, very interesting. So, well, we came to the end here, and before I let you go, I'll give you the last word, Warwick. The same question I asked Einar: what are the most serious challenges that do you see will be facing the global economy moving forward?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think the greatest challenge is actually American desperation in the context of a midterm election year. So, with an administration under domestic pressure, political pressure in the lead up to the elections in November this year, it's the greatest risk to economic activity globally is the consequence of domestic politicking in the United States itself, and how that spills over into the policies and decisions that the administration may make. Is Washington going to continue rolling out new tariff announcements whenever President Trump is unhappy about something, and then walk back on some of those? Are there going to be more uncertainties created with new tariffs? What's the Supreme Court going to say about President Trump's tariffs, and how will President Trump respond in the event that the Supreme Court determines that they have been unconstitutionally imposed? These are uncertainties. So when we're talking about risk, part of the question is some of the known uncertainties that we have before us. And I think that they are the most obvious ones. The other dynamics, of course, relate to how the conflict in Ukraine will unfold. And all reports indicate that Russia continues to accelerate its progress. And I would expect, I did some numbers prior to Christmas, through some modified Lanchester models, which is mathematical models that look at warfare. I would expect that the attritional war is going to reach a final tipping point sometime in the next 6 to 9 months, all other things remaining equal, and given what we know about the limitations of Western munition supplies. And as that unfolds to its logical military conclusion, that is likely to also shake the configuration of things in Europe itself, bringing on board new uncertainties. And the last one, of course, and I think Einar touched on this very, very powerfully, is the risks to global oil supply in the event of there being some kind of an American intervention vis-a-vis Iran. Now, people talk a lot about Iranian oil to China, but what they forget to mention is that about 20% of global oil flows through the Straits of Hormuz, and that's oil from a whole bunch of folk, basically upstream, so to speak. And if there is a blockade or anything that will impact on Iran's ability to ship oil, I would expect that Iran will also ensure that no oil ships, and that is going to create incredible pressures right across the globe. It will affect everybody. China's oil buffers are about 6 months, and it has been reducing its dependence economically on oil, and it will continue to do that. But it has about 6 months worth of buffers, but does everyone else in the world want China re-entering the global market big time? Because that will actually push prices up substantially. So they are the three main things I would suggest. Essentially, domestic American politicking in the context of a midterm year and ongoing American economic crises. The unfolding of the logical military conclusion of the battle in Ukraine, and ultimately the risks to global oil supplies as a result of American interventions in the Middle East.
Wow, very, very insightful, Warwick. I can't thank you enough, my friend. Just for the community, I'm going to put on the chat box the 2 links to the TIO channel. That's for Warwick, and the Substack. If you can subscribe to those, if you want to read and learn and sort of up your game intellectually speaking. So those are the 2 links. You might want to check them out. So Warwick, I can't thank you enough, my friend. On behalf of the community, we are so grateful to you for carving out time for us. I know how busy you are, and it means a lot to me when you literally when you come on the show here just to help my community learn a new perspective. So I'm very, very grateful to you.
It's been a pleasure once again, and I always look forward to talking with you and learning from you and Einar.
Likewise. For the community, remember to join me tomorrow. I will be talking about Cuba. Yeah, there is something going on with Cuba. I'll be talking about that tomorrow. And on the 29th, we're going to have Carl is going to be here. So hope you enjoy listening to Warwick Powell and Einar Tangen. And I look forward to our next monthly conversation with them. It's a treat that I hope you enjoyed it. So see you guys. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, remember, geopolitics impacts your daily life in more ways than one. Till next time. Bye-bye.